holding this event in March or April, I think, 2020. But then something big happened and our plans had to change. So I think that was our first casualty of events and project at Theos. But we're really pleased that it can eventually happen. And we have Alec here. It's a beautiful and fascinating book, really through the sort of emotional forces which shaped something called unbelief, perhaps before there was an intellectual position called atheism. And I think it, for me at least, raised all sorts of questions and gave some answers as well on what it actually means to call yourself a believer too. So I think something in there for everybody. As we're now on Zoom, I'm afraid we can't offer you canapes or the conversation we might have had over a glass of wine, but hopefully you are all here with something satisfying for lunch instead. Just have a few bits of housekeeping from me before we start. In terms of timings, Alec's going to talk for about 10 minutes. Then we're going to have about 20 minutes, 15 minutes of discussion. And then the rest of the time is put over to your questions. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for those. We would ask that you don't use the chat box while Alec's speaking. We've had feedback from other events that that's a bit distracting for people. And we want to give our speakers our full attention. So if we just pause and take it in while that is ongoing. And then if you can use the Q&A function for questions, then please do be adding those whenever you like. I think only I can see those actually. So that won't be distracting anybody. And it would be great to hear what this is setting off for you as you listen. We'll be finishing at 1:30 sharp, and we're strict about our timings for lunchtime events, in case you're on a lunch break. So apologies in advance if we don't get to your question. We are also live streaming this on YouTube, but we are only taking questions from Zoom. So you are in the lucky position that you can also engage with Alec while he's joining us. So without further ado, let me give a proper introduction to Alec Ryrie. Professor Alec Ryrie is, of course, the author of Unbelievers, An Emotional History of Doubt, and of numerous other books, including Protestants, The Faith That Made the Modern World, and the prize-winning Being Protestant in Reformation Britain. He is Professor of the History of Christianity at Durham University, Professor of Divinity at Gresham College, London, co-editor of the Journal of Ecclesiastical History, and a Fellow of the British Academy. He's had numerous radio and TV appearances and has written for the Wall Street Journal, Daily Telegraph, CNN, Salon, Foreign Affairs, History Today, BBC History, Church Times, and many other outlets. Alec was also actually my doctoral examiner on early modern religion back in 2017. So I'm delighted that we're in a slightly more informal setting today, which is certainly what we're striving for. So I'm going to stop talking now, and then we're going to pass over to Alec. So please do, I guess, give virtual round of applause, and delighted to hear what you have to say.
Well, Maddie, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's lovely to be with all of you and with Theos particularly. Let me share my screen so I can show you just a couple of pictures while I'm talking rather than staring at my mug for the whole time. So my starting point for this book really is this quote from the philosopher Charles Taylor, who asked, why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in, say, 1500 in our Western society, while in 2000, many of us find it not only easy, but even inescapable. I'm going to take the fact of that shift, the fact that in Europe, North America, their cultural offshoots, the old Christendom, that in those cultural contexts, unbelief is now the cultural default, and that religious practice is a countercultural stance that requires some fairly steady effort. I'm going to take that for granted. I should have started from Nietzsche's famous claim that God is dead and we kill him, which I think is also plainly true when taken as a claim about Western society and culture, though not, of course, necessarily a claim about God, him or herself. Now, if I were a philosopher, I might be asking what that claim means, but I'm a historian, and that is a simpler creature. And so to me, Nietzsche's claim sounds like a murder mystery. So God is dead. Who killed him? When did it happen? And what weapons were used? Now, the usual answers to that are philosophers, scientists, and intellectuals done it. It happened during the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution, 18th, 19th centuries, and it was done by means of repeated bludgeoning. And the normal story runs through Spinoza in the 1660s, showing that a world without God could be philosophically coherent. Then Voltaire and his friends and allies shredding the church's moral authority, Hume demolishing its metaphysics, Darwin explaining the origins of life without reference to God, so that by the time we get to Nietzsche, he is announcing a death that's already taken place. He's not committing a murder himself. And the reason I wrote my book is because I don't accept that story. I think the timescale, the suspects, and the murder weapons are all wrong. The most obvious problem with that classic timescale of the history of atheism, with that sort of starting point of sometime around 1700, is that we can find plenty of examples of unbelief and rumors of unbelief well before that period, deep into the Middle Ages, the so-called Age of Faith. The great French literary historian Lucien Febvre famously argued that unbelief was impossible in pre-modern times, and it's become very fashionable to take potshots at him for this overblown claim. But actually, the point he made was a bit subtler. I mean, he was well aware that pre-modern Europeans frequently attacked religion and even God himself, sometimes in pretty scabrous terms, and also that they regularly accused each other of unbelief. His point was just that these attacks and accusations had no intellectual substance to them. And so he concluded with sort of magnificently Gallic disdain. If I had the nerve, I'd do it in the accent, but I don't quite. He said that this sort of unbelief did not matter, historically speaking. It hardly deserves to be discussed, any more than the sneers of the drunkard in the tavern who guffaws when he's told that the earth is moving under him and with him at such a speed that it can't even be felt. So pre-17th century unbelief doesn't count because it's not philosophically respectable and sophisticated. And now, if you're only interested in the history of atheism as a system of ideas, then I think that's the end of the story, and in which case you don't want to read my book. What interests me is the evidence that unbelief existed in practice before it existed in theory. In which case, we've not just been looking at the wrong period, we've been profiling the wrong suspects. Because intellectuals and philosophers may think that they make the weather, but they're more often driven by it. People like me who read and write books have a persistent tendency to overestimate the power of ideas. Some of us sometimes change our beliefs and our lives as the result of a chain of conscious reasoning, but it doesn't happen very often, and it doesn't usually happen quite as honestly as we think it does. If there's one thing that we've collectively learned in the last 5 years or so, it's that intellectual elites often struggle to bring their societies with them. Their default role is often just to tag along behind, explaining why things have inevitably turned out the way they did. So the conventional story is that philosophers attacked religion and people therefore stopped believing. But what if people stopped believing and therefore found that they needed arguments to justify their unbelief? After all, most of us make the great choices in our lives, our beliefs and values and identities and purposes, intuitively, embedded in our social and historical contexts, usually without being able to articulate why we've done it, often without being aware that we have done it. If we're inclined that way, we might then assemble some rationalizations for our choices. And those rationalizations might even be true, but true in a sort of meager post hoc kind of way. And I think if I were talking about religious belief, that would be so obvious as to hardly be worth saying. My point simply is that it's not just belief that human beings choose for instinctive, inarticulate, intuitive reasons. We choose unbelief for the same sorts of reasons and by the same kinds of processes. And if that's right, then the crucial part of the history of unbelief is the period before the philosophers made it intellectually respectable, when the raw dough begins to bubble with unexplained, maybe unwelcome energy. And it's then that the intellectuals find that it's urgent, they discover ways to bake, slice, and package the thing. I don't think it's any great surprise that the Enlightenment philosophers could develop atheistic philosophies. Anybody who needs a philosophy badly enough will find one. It's not as if the arguments against God were anything new in the 17th century. The question isn't why did those criticisms come from, but why did some Europeans start to find them so compelling? And why do we nowadays in our wider culture find those arguments that are very old, newly and freshly compelling? And I think to answer that question, we don't need an intellectual history of atheism. We need an emotional history. I don't mean that the intellect and the emotions are opposites, or that emotion is irrational. The idea that head and heart are opposites is, I think, a nonsense that crept into European thought in the 17th century and we haven't managed to shake off yet. My gripe is with what one recent historian, Dominic Erdős, calls the intellectualist fallacy, which he says is a tendency to privilege the clean logic of ideas above the raw fuel of human experience amongst the forces of historical change. So when I talk about emotion, I don't just mean spontaneous or involuntary passion, but also our conscious intellect, which is an emotional event. We may not be able to govern our emotions fully, but we do curate and manage them. And we also learn them from the culture around us, that we don't just discover them within ourselves. So when I set out to write an emotional history of atheism, that's not arguing that atheism is irrational. It's arguing that human beings are irrational, or rather that we are not merely rational. We're not calculating machines, and that our choices, if that's the right word, about what we believe or disbelieve are made intuitively with our whole selves. So the book tells two interwoven emotional stories of unbelief. Let's look at the book rather than the I tell a story of anger and one of anxiety. Anger is maybe the more obvious one of the two, grudges nurtured against an all-embracing Christian society, against the church in particular, but also against the God who oversaw it all. The unbelief of anxiety is quite different, I think. This is the unsettling, reluctant inability to keep a firm grip on doctrines that people, at least on one level, are convinced are true. And on their own, neither of those things, which I think are perennial, threatened Christendom. If anything, they're part of the moral equilibrium and self-renewal of a thriving Christian society. What makes them dangerous is the way, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, angry unbelief is turned into a weapon of mass theological destruction. And in the process, anxious unbelief gets stirred up in a way that it never has done before. And so anger becomes increasingly righteous in tone. The atheists who had previously always been seen as monsters of depravity begin to position themselves as a moral revolt against a corrupt religion and to try and find their own distinct ethics. And at the same time, your anxious unbelievers find that everything they try to grapple with turns to mist and shadows, and they despair of finding certainties in doctrine, and they fasten their grip onto ethics instead. So again, there's that turn towards morals. So your angry and your anxious unbelievers find themselves allying against traditional Christianity and opposing it not just on intellectual grounds, but on moral ones. And it seems to me it's that pursuit of a purified higher morality in the name of overcoming the flaws within Christianity that these folks are seeing, that then bubbles away through the modern period and comes to a particular kind of fruition in our own times. At least that's what I think is going on. But I'm starting to freewheel now. So let me pause there and hand us back to Maddie to see if she can bring some order to all of this.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much, Alec. I think that I'd said at the start that it had given me pause the book itself, that is to think about what it means to be an unbeliever or a believer. And you touched there on also what it means simply to be a human. So I think I've been thinking about this sort of thing since I read the book, and I'm sure that people here will be thinking about this long after they leave the event. Just a reminder to people before we have a sort of further chance for discussion between us, that you also can leave questions. So if you leave those in the Q&A function, then they should pop up for me, and I will put those to Alec as soon as we come to that. Also, if you're tweeting, do loop Theos into your tweets. The tweet handle is @TheosThinkTank. It might be in the chat, but yes, do tell us what you're thinking and what this is setting off for you. So let's turn to a few questions of my own, which I have many. You said in your talk just now that intellectual elites often struggle to bring their societies with them, which is a fascinating observation in itself. You're also talking about emotional trends there, which also seem to have struggled to bring their society with them for quite a long time. I'm wondering if you could say a bit about basically what happens after the early modern period. What happens once these, firstly, once these emotional sort of rumblings are given intellectual shape, but then also into our own period. Where do you see this story going, and where are we now?
That's a big question, and I need to not fall into the trap of just reciting the whole of the rest of the book at you. But I think that these two streams of anger and anxiety that I talk about in the book, I spend quite a lot of time looking in detail about what happens to them in the sort of the pivotal period, which seems to me that sort of long 17th century. But I then kind of finish by looking at how they track up to the present and into our own time. Because I think we all accept that although there's been sort of worries about secularization and atheism, or worries, celebration of it, depending on how you stand, that's an old story in Europe, in Western culture. And this is very much a specifically Western story. There's been a real change of tempo and change in the nature of this story in the lifetimes of those of us here, since the 1960s, let's say, in which most of European North American societies, or many, have come to see themselves as post-Christian, as explicitly secular societies. And I think the key element to that is, again, this question of ethics. That so much of this critique, these twin critiques of traditional Christianity, were based on trying to use Christian ethics against itself, to critique traditional Christianity in the name of an ethical code that was broadly Christian in its derivation. So that in the 19th, early 20th century, even your most outspoken atheists would usually go out of their way to say, but nevertheless, we don't believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, but we believe that he was the most outstanding moral teacher ever to have lived. He was the most morally potent figure in our society. What it seems to me has happened in the post-60s period, and I would track it back a little bit further to the post-Second World War period, is that sense of a shared ethics being ultimately, although sometimes distantly, grounded in a Christian consciousness, that link has been broken. And for me, it seems that we're now at a point where we define our collective morals not in relation to Christianity, but in relation to the notion of human rights, and above all, fundamentally, to the narrative of the Second World War. I've said before in many settings that I think, whereas a century ago the most potent moral figure in our culture was Jesus, and now the most potent moral figure in our culture is Adolf Hitler. Obviously, one a positive, the other a negative exemplar, and that shift from a positive to a negative exemplar is, I think, really consequential. So that pursuit of purified moralism has taken us into these deep waters of secularism. I also think this is unsustainable, that the attempt to create a new social moral consensus around this sort of anti-Nazi narrative and the ways in which we've mythologized that. It seems to me that that's the wheels are starting to come off that, and a lot of the social cultural ructions that we're going through at the moment seem to me to be based around that breakdown of a shared morality, so that this new secular age that we've been enjoying or enduring, I think is a lot less stable than it looks. I don't think that means that Christendom is about to snap back, but that we are venturing into uncharted territory.
Something there quite poignant about thinking that we're still in an emotional history. The question is, what are we actually coming to terms with? What are we grappling with? And that the period that you chart in the book is about, well, it's hundreds of years, but particularly sort of what is the legacy of the Reformation, and that really only coming to light properly 150, 160, 200 years afterwards. And that's sort of the timescale we're starting to look at with World War II now, that actually we are living in a society that is still coming to terms with the implications of that, and what emotional impact that has on our societies. I think it is, I think, on any showing the decisive moral event of our times. I know that I always think of that that Victorian label for the Christian narrative, the greatest story ever told, that then gets made into the unwatchable film and all that. I think for our culture, it's the Second World War is the greatest story ever told. It's as a French novelist who said, it's our Trojan War. It's the story that we keep going back to. And I was born in the early 70s, but when I hear the recordings of those speeches and so on, it turns my spine to water. It has these things have an emotional purchase on us that's not too different from the way that Christian scripture once did. It's really fascinating. Obviously, World War is a global, it's in the name, it's a global event. You say that the story you're telling is a Western one. And also you say that it's largely a Protestant one, which may seem counterintuitive to some of our audience to talk about sort of a Protestant brand of atheism as opposed to any other kinds. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, and also, is there a sort of Catholic atheism ongoing at the same time? Is it, and what does that look like?
Oh, I mean, I feel on much firmer ground saying that Catholic atheism is very different from Protestant atheism. And if you want to know what the differences between the two of them, look at what American secularism versus French secularism looks like. You know, they both of these are atheisms that have emerged in dialogue with particular cultures. I do think that Protestantism has a particular role to play in this as an accelerant to many of these tendencies towards skepticism. You know, a lot of the original Protestant critique of Catholicism, you know, going back to the Reformation itself, is about weaponizing skepticism. Is looking at things like the doctrine of transubstantiation and saying, "What, really? Nah." There's a kind of mockery that's built into that, a refusal to believe, a use of incredulity as a weapon. It's said at the time that, you know, the corruption of Protestantism is atheism, whereas the corruption of Catholicism is superstition. And you know, those are the twin dangers between which Christians steer, but that Protestantism leans one way and Catholicism the other. And I think that's true, and you can see that amongst many of the Catholics who early on start to feel the purchase of this kind of skepticism. Those are Catholics who have become deeply familiar with and interested in Protestant ideas themselves, or picking up on those sorts of themes. But of course, Catholics and Protestants are locked in this existential conflict, and therefore learning from and countering one another. And so when Protestants start deploying incredulity and skepticism as a weapon against Catholics quickly are, you know, in this arms race, picking up the same kind of weapon. And so, you know, within a generation of Protestants mocking Catholics' inability to the ridiculous doctrine of the Mass, as they see it, Catholics are mocking Protestants' ridiculous faith that the Bible, this book with such a complex history, could be the Word of God in any self-evident way. Of course, Catholics do believe that the Bible is Scripture, but they would want to emphasize the role of the Church as discerning and authorizing that which Protestants don't accept. And so the result is a kind of mutually assured destruction going on here, in which both confessions are doing a much better job of tearing down one another's beliefs than necessarily of establishing their own.
Really helpful distinction. We do have lots of questions coming in, so I don't want to prevent people from having those heard. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, to put them in the Q&A box. One final one from me, although it's not actually my final question. I'll think about this for a long time. That one of the aspects of the book which I found particularly fascinating was that you sort of noted a strange absence of real grappling with the problem of suffering. And I think that is often one of the most popular objections to belief in God in our own setting. I wonder if you could just, well, firstly for our audience, many of whom I'm sure will be coming to this for the first time, just say a bit about that. But also what you think that says about the time that they were in. Like, it didn't seem to be a huge issue and it was a society that had lots of suffering in it, but it didn't seem to be the reason they were either anxious or angry.
Thanks for raising that, Maddie. It was one of those points that really surprised me from this material. You know, I've read now a lot of accounts from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries of people, you know, really wrestling with doubts. And the old problem of suffering, you know, how could a good God permit so much suffering in the world? Therefore, the fact that there is suffering means that there isn't a benevolent and an omnipotent God. And that's a very old argument. You know, that goes deep back into the ancient world. It's a perennial idea. And I kind of expected it to be one of the things that people were wrestling with. And it just doesn't show up in the sources that I was reading. There are plenty of other things they do wrestle with. In particular, they would really struggle with the idea of the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the dead, and with of the inspiration of Scripture, or of the divinity of Christ, or all those sorts of things. But that particular problem of evil just doesn't seem to be something that, although it's an intellectual problem that many people recognize, even at the time, it doesn't appear from the sources that I've looked at to have the kind of emotional purchase on people's lives that we've come to expect in the modern period. And I've realized after writing the book, this is in no way an original point, that C.S. Lewis actually made the same observation back in the 1940s. He says that, asks us to reflect on the fact that all of the world's great religions were first preached and practiced in an age without anesthesia, in which pain, just quotidian bodily pain, was a much more everyday experience than it is in the modern age. And the point when you really start to see the problem of evil biting at people historically is in the era of the First World War, when it's being mobilized in that kind of way. And of course, it's also got a polemical value. People are using it as a weapon, but often it feels like a stage point, rather than something that really does explain the convictions that people have. I still find this a little mysterious, because it seems like an argument that should have real purchase. It may just be, as I say, that in our age we've kind of forgotten what pain really is, and it's become sufficiently unfamiliar, just physical pain, that when we encounter it, we don't quite know how to cope with it. Of course, the way that most religions have, and certainly Christianity does this, have typically formulated the problem of pain is not how do we philosophically explain the existence of pain, but given the reality of it, what spiritual resources can we find in order to cope with that? And it may be that the fact that Christianity and other traditions have got those sorts of practical answers to the problem, that trumps their inability or difficulties to come up with convincing abstract answers. Again, practice matters more than theory.
It's fascinating. We do certainly live in a society where pain we try and keep it behind closed doors, and so perhaps that is harder to cope with once we're behind the closed doors. We've got loads of questions coming in, so I'm going to turn to the audience queries now. We've got one from Richard Norman, who says, were Spinoza, Hume, Darwin, etc. just providing post hoc rationalization? And if so, why has the intellectual debate been so vigorous, so preoccupied people, and caused such anguish?
Well, I don't want to be dissing those gents. They're doing, and well, Spinoza particularly, I think, is something of a special case. He would vigorously deny having been an atheist. Just doing post hoc rationalization, no, but I think they are trying to take something that already exists in an incoherent, implicit sense, and articulate it and express it clearly, and find ways of resolving that make sense of their ethical and philosophical intuitions. Darwin's something of a special case, obviously, because he's working with empirical empirical evidence to answer sort of limited scientific questions. And it's others who use his scientific theories to derive critiques of Christianity in a way that he himself is much warier of doing. And that maybe gives you a sense of the alternatives that were possible here. You can imagine, and I mean, there's plenty of representatives of an enlightenment that would pick up on many of the same intellectual themes, and certainly in scientific terms, reach many of the same milestones without having been taken to have the same implications. And you really need the moral ferocity of a Spinoza, or the anger and contempt of a Hume or a Voltaire or a Tom Paine, or the blistering fury of someone like Marx or Bakunin, to really take this forward. So I'm afraid I'd be inclined to look at those folks also as emotional actors. Like I say, the emotion and the intellect aren't opposites.
Is there nobody that doesn't have emotions?
Well, I've yet to meet them.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee. This is a fun question. I'd be very interested to hear what you think about it. What would you say about the growing spiritual openness in the West, and increasing numbers engaging with holistic milieu? Is spiritual belief in energy, etc., driven by the same ideas on intuitiveness and emotion? So I suppose looking for seeds of new emotional moves and where that's going from now on. What do you make of that kind of?
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that there's a lot of interest in these new religious movements or spiritual movements of one kind or another. I'm a little bit wary of over-reading them, just because my sense from the stats I've seen, and I'm not any kind of expert on this stuff, is that while they're eye-catching, these things remain numerically quite small, and I suspect they may be relatively shallow-rooted as well. That they're going to be changing reasonably quickly. Having said that, I do, if there's one thing I'd really want to take my stand on, it's that this sort of emotional framing is, I think it's essential for understanding the kinds of religious and spiritual, or anti-religious or anti-spiritual decisions and moves that people make. So if these movements are flourishing, or whatever movements may happen to be flourishing, I think the questions that I would want to ask are, what is it that gives these things purchase in people's lives? It's not necessarily, I don't think it's likely to be because they have sat down and studied metaphysics and persuaded themselves that this is a more credible account of the cosmos than one that they've found elsewhere, because that's just not how human beings are, most people. It's going to be because this has been something that they have found nourishment of some kind in, or a shelter from fear, or whatever it might be, which is not to disrespect them, because that's what we all do, and we then come along and rationalize it afterwards. I got very interested for a while when I was researching this in modern flat earthers, who are a kind of, if you want, an almost kind of innocent example of the modern tendency towards conspiratorial and irrational thinking. I think this is one of your best ones. The assumption that the world is lying to you on a large scale, and the appeal of this kind of movement. But you can apply the same sort of logic to many of the other conspiracy theories that have become so much more familiar in the past few years. I think with those things, as well as with religious movements. The question to ask is not how can somebody believe something so obviously false, because that's a maneuver that I think most of us are capable of under the right circumstances. But what is it about that system or trend that gives it emotional purchase in people's lives, that makes them really want it to be true? And
it's really helpful.
From that, everything else follows.
It's really helpful there to sort of think that finding the answer to that requires us to think both about what's going on and both about, what's going on in humans, what are we like, and you can't answer that one without the other, perhaps.
I mean, certainly if you look back at the Middle Ages, I think that the atheism of that period looks very much like a conspiracy theory. I think the reason I got into the flat earthers is because they're very reminiscent of medieval atheists. The kind of people Lefebvre was sneering at in the pub. That tendency to doubt whatever you've been told because you've got this kind of mulish skepticism to it causes all kinds of problems. But I have a sneaking respect for it nevertheless.
Great. We're running a little short time. I'm going to start taking some questions together. These aren't particularly related, but there are two that come from the same person. So one is this discussion just male-centered? What's the female experience of unbelief? A huge question. So a little bit about, where's the place of gender in this? And then also we've had several questions about basically these big events. Some saying, what about 9/11 as an alternative big event? And also questions asking, well, what's the next one then? Is it the pandemic or climate change? So can you deal with all of those?
I'm not sure I can deal with all of those in one breath, but let me give it a go. I mean, on the gender point, yeah, I mean, absolutely. One of the things that I really wanted to do in the book is to broaden out from this story that tends to be told about kind of glowering men, usually with tremendous whiskers, and to look at a broader picture. And in particular, there's that distinction between anger and anxiety that I was making is one that's got quite a gendered skew to it. Certainly in the stuff that I've read in the accounts that I present in the book, the unbelief of anxiety is something that's much more prominent amongst the women writers that I've got, and these tend to be sort of diarists or autobiographers of one kind or another, than amongst the men. Obviously, we're talking about a society in which anger was a very gendered emotion, so that's not particularly surprising. But yeah, I think one of the advantages of this sort of approach is that it gets you away from those male educated social elites into the lives of the relatively uneducated, into the lives of women, and also, at the risk of jumping on a particular hobby horse of mine, into the lives of children. I think this is not just a story in which traditionally women have been excluded, but also the fact that these are, in pre-modern times, half of the whole population at any one time was under the age of 20. And the experience of that enormous mass of humanity, which is of course formative for those who do survive to adulthood, is one that tends to be neglected. And I think there's some real glimpses that we can make into children's wrestling with belief and unbelief as they're exposed to these ideas. As to other big events, yes, I mean, absolutely. I think you can see the way that this breakdown in the dominance of the Second World War narrative over our society you can begin to track that through the way that we've begun to reformulate that in the wake of other events. I suspect that 9/11 is one of those events which felt bigger at the time than it's going to look in retrospect, partly because at the time, as those of us who are old enough will remember, it seemed like it was the beginning of something new, and the fear was that this was the sort of thing that was going to be happening every week. And instead, 20 years on, it looks like more of a one-off, personally. But certainly that sense that this one dominant moral event, the Second World War, the Holocaust in particular, becomes the framework through which everything else has to be interpreted. That becomes harder and harder to hold on to as it kind of falls off the edge of living memory. I hope that it's not going to take a catastrophe of the same magnitude to reset our ethics. I do think the ways in which we have, maybe especially in Britain, instinctively reached for the Second World War, for Blitz spirit, as a framework through which to interpret the pandemic, has been an object lesson in how inadequate this is as a way of dealing with the real evils that confront us as a society, and what lessons you can learn from the Second World War for dealing with our slow burning climate emergency. I struggle to extract that. So perhaps that's going to be the new part of the new framework for our shared ethics. But like I say, I hope it's not going to be something that requires a top level global catastrophe to reset it. Call me an incorrigible optimist if you like.
There's also a question there, I think, about the difference between what it takes to reset a particular cluster of European countries versus a globalized world.
Indeed, and of course, the memory of the Second World War is very different in other parts of the world. The Chinese or the Russian narratives of it are very dominant but very distinct.
Thanks, Alec. We have a question here about politics. You haven't yet talked about politics. There are several examples here given. French laicite is very much a product of the French Revolution. Also, the sort of politicization of Southern Protestantism in America. The question is, do you see political history simply as a manifestation of emotional history, or as another dimension?
That's a good question, and I am well aware of the danger that I face of allowing this sort of emotional history to turn into the universal key to all knowledge, and that I occasionally need to calm down a little bit about this. Having said that, no, I do think that our politics are difficult to explain without this kind of emotional framing about them. And I think most successful politicians in most eras have understood this, instinctively or consciously, that it's the ability to manage and work within the emotional frameworks of their societies, to whip them up at the right times, to calm them down at others, and to lead them in particular directions. If politics is the art of the possible, then it's the limits of that possibility are often governed by these sorts of considerations of what a particular society can be brought to do. So, I mean, absolutely, French laicite arises out of the particular circumstances of the French Revolution and the Church's response to that, and how that then plays out. But that's also driven by the particular approach to Catholicism that the French philosophes brought to the revolutionary movement, and that animates many of those caught up in the Great Revolution and the subsequent ones, and also by the ways in which the French Catholic Church responded to it. There are a set of choices available to them, and they choose a particular road which fits with their understanding of the world, their place in it, the kind of possible martyrdoms to which to which they might be called, what they're trying to achieve. Whereas in the American context, you have this sort of strange alliance in the revolutionary era between the deistic philosophes who with that particular moral critique of Christianity, Jefferson right on top of this kind of thing, allying themselves with a whole series of church leaders and religious leaders who are mostly concerned to keep the newly established United States off their backs. So the one thing that they can agree on is that neither of them want an establishment of religion, and so the First Amendment and that kind of American hands-off approach emerges as this sort of unholy alliance between the budding secularists and the religious movements with their own agenda. So whereas in France it begins as this very confrontational thing, in the American context it's underpinned by this alliance, for all that alliance has seemed pretty wobbly at various points in the more recent past.
That's really helpful thoughts there. I'm sorry to people who we have not got to their questions. We actually do have quite a number of questions left. So all of those conversations will, I'm afraid, have to take place in a different sphere. We've got 1 minute left of the event. So I did say we'd be strict on timings. So I think that just leaves me to thank you, Alec, so much for your presence and thoughts today. I know that this has opened up a lot of new avenues of thought, clearly in the chat as well, all sorts of dimensions to this in terms of how we can best conceive a history of unbelief, particularly for an emotional direction. To the audience, thank you also for joining. We hope that you will feel inclined to join more Theos events in the future. You'll see in the chat that the details of our next event are listed. That's our annual lecture, which is on the 10th of November, Reimagining Western Education in a Time of Racial Crisis. And that's with the award-winning theologian, Dr. Willie Jennings. So you can sign up there. If you would like to hear more from Theos or indeed support us, then you can do that on the website. And if you are tweeting, as I say, do loop us in. We'd love to hear what thoughts this is sparking for you. That's it. So I hope that you all have wonderful afternoons. For those of you who are just coming to the end of your lunch break, especially so. And I hope that we'll see you all again soon. Thanks so much, Alec. Again, another, don't know if I can react, but I can give a round of applause on behalf of everybody at the event. Thanks so much.